And welcome to this recording of this GCSE guide to an inspector calls. As normal, we're going to be looking at the two assessment criteria, that is AO1, understanding what the play is about, and AO2, its language, form and structure. This recording is going to focus on Arthur Birling. As with any character, the first thing we look at is, of course, the stage direction. He's described as heavy-looking, rather pretentious, with fairly easy manners, and rather provincial in his speech. These all suggest then that Priestley sets up his audience to dislike Mr Birling due to his upper-class dress but lack of manners. The adjective, pretentious, suggests he's over the top and wants to impress by boasting. Provincial implies a man who still has a regional accent, which lets us know he was once from a lower background than his dress and position suggests. We know at the beginning of the play he seems to mention port quite a lot. This implies the upper class of the world is distorted, in this case by what is a fortified or very strong wine. He perhaps wants to make his worldview look happier and drinks because of that. Now, the fact he mentions cigars right at the start might be fairly inconsequential, but the cigar probably represents nothing other than Burling's gluttony and his excess wealth. Here is then a mini guide to Mr Birling. He's keen to impress, he's dismissive of those below him. There's a lot of dramatic irony being used as he references different historical points. He appears quite selfish, but also quite superior to other characters. Above everything else, he values his reputation and is really concerned that throughout the play his knighthood may be put at risk. As with any of the characters, it's important to note that many of them can be divided between the capitalists and the socialists. If you're not sure what a capitalist or a socialist is, please pause the video now and read some of the information. Arthur Birling represents capitalism. He is a man who worked hard on his own business and made money from it. He is, in his words, a self-made man. He also represents a rich, arrogant businessman that capitalism created. He has risen through the social classes through hard work and determination and will keep going. He is a typical man of the era who treats women in his life as objects rather than people. Mr Birling is the worst at this of the characters, as he sees women in his life as representations of his own power. He also represents the patriarchal, or male-dominated, society where all women are abused and objectified. He even does this to his own daughter. A grade 9 might also notice that Mr Birling is also aware that he doesn't really fit in with the upper classes. These were traditional men who made money from inheritance. This is because of his provincial background. He is perhaps insecure about this, which is why he's so desperate to impress men like Gerald. Burling is a hard-faced profiteer, the kind of manufacturer who would prosper from war. But his statement, "there's nothing to gain from war," is true, perhaps suggesting that he doesn't really understand how capitalism works. The same is true of joining business with Crofts Limited. Without competition, prices won't rise. If he's successful and Burling and Company and Crofts Limited join up, that means prices might actually fall because there's no competition between the two companies. Perhaps this suggests then the message of the play isn't really socialism at all, but simply thinking about a fairer form of capitalism where everyone works together. Here then is a recording of a song that might help you remember some of the key points about Mr Arthur Birling.
So pleased with life on this special evening, waiting to secure business dealings. Sheila will work a better class. This will give you some kudos at last. So full of advice, you make a long speech. No strikes, no war, is what you preach. The strikes are brewing, your head's in the sand. War is looming, but you don't understand. I never take responsibility. I have dreams of being nobility. I never accept responsibility. Boss me and you'll meet hostility. So self-absorbed, you boast of your graces and titles you've held, and friends in high places, but inside you're still a provincial guy. When the inspector arrives, your power will die. So intent on being a strong businessman, wage increases are not part of your plan. Faced with a strike, you took practical steps. A few sackings are what the industry expects. I never take responsibility. I've dreams of being nobility. I never accept responsibility. Force me and you'll meet hostility. So confident your actions, they are right. When accused of a crime, you put up a fight. Despite the strong stance, you're starting to shake. So when the focus shifts, you're glad of the break. So full of fear that there'll be a big scandal, you offer thousands to avoid going to trial. To avoid your guilt, you abolish your son. You regroup the rest, the reproaches have begun. I never take responsibility. I've dreams of being nobility. I never accept responsibility. Force me and you'll meet hostility. So frantic for escape, you start to suppose it was all a hoax, is what you propose. When Gerald confirms your new suspicion, you revert back to your old possession. So full of relief, you think the danger's past. You laugh at your children, your complacence is vast. But just when you think it will all be fine, an inspector is announced for a second time. I never take responsibility. I've dreams of being nobility. I never accept responsibility. Force me and you'll meet hostility. So peace with life on this special evening, waiting to secure business dealings.
If If you were to look at the text as a religious text, you might notice many of the characters represent the 7 deadly sins. In fact, Eva Smith could even link to the 7 heavenly virtues. Arthur represents the sins of gluttony and pride. Burling has hubris, or a tragic flaw, as his downfall is caused by his excessive pride. Let's join then Arthur at the dinner table, talking to Gerald, then Eric when he walks in, about his hopes then for the future.
Oh, thanks. Though she does not object to, my girl, feels that you might have done better for yourself socially.
Oh, I really don't think so.
Oh, well, that's all right. I don't blame her. She comes from an old county family. It's quite natural. But what I wanted to say is that there's a fair chance my name might find its way onto the next honours list. Just a knighthood, of course.
Oh, I say. Well, congratulations.
Yeah, well, I was Lord Mayor 2 years ago when royalty visited us, and I've always been considered a good party man, so I think there's a good chance of a knighthood. Well, as long as we don't cause any trouble, get into the police court, start a scandal, eh?
You seem a nice, well-behaved sort of family to me.
Well, it's just a matter of keeping out of trouble for a few months.
What's the joke?
Oh, nothing. Do you want another glass of port?
Yes, please. Mother says we mustn't stay too long. But I don't think it matters. I left them talking about clothes again. You'd think a girl never had any clothes before she got married. Women are potty about them.
Ah, but what you don't understand, my boy, is that clothes mean something quite different to a woman. They're a sort of sign or token of the self-respect.
Oh, that's true. Yes. I remember this.
What?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Sounds a bit fishy to me.
Oh, we don't know what these young boys get up to these days. More money to spend and time to spare than I had when I was Eric's age. Yeah, they worked us hard and kept us pretty short of cash. Mind you, we did manage to break out and have a bit of fun sometimes.
I'm sure you did.
Oh, well, there's no harm in that, as long as you keep it in its right place.
No. What?
But these days, when things are so much easier, what I want to say is, now, I don't want to lecture you young fellas, is that a man has to make his own way, look after himself and his family, and as long as he does that, he won't come to much harm. Of course, the way some of these cranks are talking and writing now, you'd think that everybody had to look after everybody else, community and all that nonsense. Take it from me. A man has to mind his business, look after himself and his own...
Somebody at the front door.
Well, I don't answer it. Well, come on, Gerald, we'll have another glass of this and then we'll join the ladies.
Arthur then interrupted in his preaching to the younger generation by the arrival of the inspector. Important notes to remember about Arthur in Act 1. Arthur is quick to focus on the business advantage gained by Sheila's marriage to Gerald. He talks of this even before her happiness. He speaks on more than one occasion about people needing to look after themselves and not other people. He makes several predictions that the audience know to be untrue. These all combine to ensure that Arthur and his views come across as quite foolish or stupid. He is keen for people to understand his position in society. He tells Gerald of a possible knighthood and tells the inspector he used to be Lord Mayor and he's friends with the chief constable. He's also questioned by the inspector. Let's begin to look then at some of the key parts of Arthur's speech throughout Act 1. Burling starts off by saying, "Just let me finish, Eric. You've got a lot to learn yet. And I'm talking as a hard-headed, practical man of business. And I say there isn't a chance of war. The world's developing so fast it will make war impossible. Look at the progress we're making. In a year or two, we'll have airplanes that will be able to go anywhere. And look at the way the automobile's been making headway. Bigger and faster all the time. And then ships. Why, a friend of mine went over this new liner last week. 46,800 tons. 46,800 tons. New York in 5 days, and every luxury, and unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. That's what you've got to keep your eye on, facts like that, progress like that. And not a few German officers talking nonsense and a few scaremongers here making a fuss about nothing. Now you 3 young people listen to this, and remember what I'm telling you now. In 20 or 30 years' time, let's say in the 40s, you might be giving a little party like this, and your son or daughter might be getting engaged. And I'll tell you, by that time you're living in a world that has forgotten all these capital versus labour agitations and all these silly little war scares. There'll be peace and prosperity and rapid progress everywhere. Except, of course, in Russia, which will always be behindhand naturally. As we now study his use of language, his structure here, we might notice he begins with, "Just let me finish, Eric." This cuts off his own son, suggesting he doesn't really respect him. The use of Eric's name suggests a form of control. He tells him he's got a lot to learn yet. Burling positions himself as a teacher, a direct contrast to the way the inspector acts. He keeps on using the phrase hard-headed, and this is often repeated by Burling. He knows that he often harms others to get what he wants, but feels profit and success make this worthwhile. Burling, in the middle of this speech, lists his opinions as if they're facts. He is certain he's in the right. Burling deliberately contrasts himself with the younger generations, as he begins with, "Now you 3 young people," implying he is superior to them. Priestley uses dramatic irony here, as the audience for Inspector Calls is sitting there watching the play in 1945. They know the world after World War II is not a world without its problems. Burling uses a casual, uncaring tone here, as if the events he describes have already happened. The frequent dashes show his growing excitement as he controls his willing audience. He knows that Eric and Gerald are listening intently and capitalises on that. Another section from this part of the play begins with Burling, confidentially. "By the way, there's something I'd like to mention, in strict confidence, while we're by ourselves. I have an idea that your mother, Lady Croft, while she doesn't object to my girl, feels you might have done better for yourself socially." Gerald, in stage direction, rather embarrassed, begins to murmur some dissent, but Burling checks him. "No, Gerald, it's all right. Don't blame her. She comes from an old county family, landed people and so forth, so it's only natural. But what I wanted to say is that there's a fair chance I might find my way onto the next honours list. Just a knighthood, of course." "Oh, I say, congratulations." "Thanks. It's a bit too early for that, so don't say anything. But I've had a hint or two. You see, I was Lord Mayor here 2 years ago when royalty visited us, and I've always been regarded as a sound, useful party man. So, well, I gather there's a very good chance for knighthood, so long as we behave ourselves, don't get into the police court or start a scandal, eh?" Burling begins to manipulate Gerald and seeks to impress him. It is seen as very bad form or very bad manners to suggest you might have a knighthood before receiving it. This is evidence of Burling's hubris. She talks about Gerald's mother coming from an old county family. This is a reference to the higher social class that Gerald comes from. Burling is acutely aware of his place on the natural order. He sees everyone as having a place in society, the servant and the served. Just a knighthood, of course, could suggest that Burling wants more than just a knighthood. His tone here suggests he wants to downplay his achievements, yet still wants them to be known, implying then he is egotistical. He regards himself as a sound, useful party man. This shows he's self-serving. He's listing his assets, things he's good at. He regards himself as a bit of a sociality, a role he likely adopted when he made his money. Burling isn't naturally a good communicative man. He is someone who has had to learn to be that way to suit his new upper-class audience. He mentions, of course, at the end here, a scandal. This is an example of Priestley's ironic foreshadowing. The events from here are a scandal, as we find out about what happened to Eva Smith. The stage direction here is very specific, which makes us think Mr Birling is the villain of the play. Another example then from Act 1, Burling. But this is the point. I don't want to lecture you two young fellows again. But what so many of you don't seem to understand now that things are so much easier is that a man has to make his own way. He has to look after himself and his family too. Of course, when he has one. So long as he does that, he won't come to much harm. But by the way some of these cranks talk and write now, you'd think everyone has to look after everybody else, as if we're all mixed up together like bees in a hive. A man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own, and we hear a sharp ring as, of course, the inspector arrives. Eric then interrupts by saying somebody at the door, perhaps eager then to escape his father. Burling's tone here is tired and frustrated. He lacks the education to teach his children well, so just repeats the same messages over and over again. Where he says, I don't want to lecture you two young fellows again, but what so many of you don't seem to understand. This implies the growing gap between the old and the young, the older generation and the younger generation. The younger socialists are misunderstood by Burling and are called stupid or cranks. This is Burling's mantra and is all he knows. A man has to make his own way. He is a self-made man and is proud of it. He expects others to be able to do the same, particularly his own son. He even simplifies the message to make sure he is understood. The noun cranks implies that Burling believes are crazy. He simply lacks the emotional understanding to see things from a different perspective. The cranks he's referring to are the socialists. The simile here, like bees in a hive, is deliberately linked to communism, the ultimate form of socialism, as the hive represents the ultimate division of labour as all the bees work together for the greater good. This is something that Burling does not understand, and so almost laughs at. Burling, stopping to listen, begins to repeat his original message and is interrupted on his point by the inspector. This moment in the play is suggested both by Burling beginning to listen, but also Eric's blunt, informal response. Burling cut off then in his prime as he makes clear his message over and over again. Key quotes from Act 1. Please pause the screen now and make a note of these key quotes. Now, there are different historical links that Burling makes, the most obvious of which is his link to war. Burling is sure that there won't be a war, yet all the signs suggest that there will be. War is the ultimate result of capitalism, countries fighting for power.
The world of 1914, a time of modern technology, culture, and fashion. Truly the height of civilization. Let's have a war. Everyone knew a big war was coming. France wanted some stuff back that Germany had taken from it. Germany wanted to take more of everyone's stuff, and they were building a big sexy navy that was making the British uncomfortable. These two empires thought they were really cool, but lots of different people who lived there didn't think it was so cool. And some of them had even been declaring independence with help from Russia. Everyone was talking about each other behind each other's backs, throwing the fact that military technology had come a long way since the last major war, and suddenly everyone was pretty eager to beat each other up. In this area of Austria-Hungary lived some Serbs and Bosnians who hated living in Austria-Hungary. So the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand goes there for a nice drive in an open-top car with his cars republished in advance. And that went just about as well as you'd expect. Some assassins were waiting for him along the way and threw bombs at his car, but they missed and blew up some officers behind him instead. So the Archduke goes into hiding, leaves Sarajevo, and the whole war never happens. Except no, the Archduke doesn't leave, but instead goes back out in the open-top car to visit the injured officers in hospital. The driver takes a wrong turn and by sheer coincidence gets stuck beside one of the failed assassins, who shoots him. Austria-Hungary is understandably pissed about all this, and they think the Serbian government had something to do with it, which they might have. So they go to their ally Germany and say, "Hey Germany, we're going to declare war on Serbia," and Germany is all for that. So Austria-Hungary send a big list of impossible demands to Serbia, and when Serbia refuses, they declare war. Austria-Hungary and Germany are friends, and Serbia is protected by Russia, who's friends with France, so they all declare war on each other. Montenegro joins in too. France and Britain also have a kind of alliance, so when France says, "Hey Britain, you got my back?" Britain is like, "Maybe." And then...
While watching this video, it's very interesting to see the role that Britain adopts just before war broke out. This is the same role that the Burling seem to adopt. The idea of being asked for help by other countries that it is right to support, but being really on the fence about it and not sure whether they should. The Burlings, just like Britain, have every chance to make a difference to Eva Smith. Mr Birling in particular, if he hadn't have fired Eva Smith, potentially could have saved her. Britain's the same here. There is an argument that perhaps the First War wouldn't have happened if Britain had stepped in and helped France. The second historical link we can easily make is that to the Titanic. Burling is impressed by the advances of technology and progress made by business. The Titanic is the ultimate symbol of this. But we know what happened to the Titanic. The Titanic's fate symbolises the Burling's own fate. The events of the play destroy the Burling's sophisticated veneer. This once great family is torn apart by Eva Smith's death. The Burlings are very much a symbol of wealth and prosperity. They've done incredibly well for themselves, but it takes very little to damage that reputation. The third link he makes is to miners' strikes that were happening throughout 1910 onwards. The miners, just like Eva Smith, were striking for more money. Simplistically, Burling is made to look like a fool here, as well as the historical events for examples dramatic irony, but unlike the audience, Burling is expressing commonly held views of the time. He wasn't the only one to believe that actually all the things he mentions would be successful. His views are ones that also represent optimism about the future. Let's now look at what happens to Arthur as the play develops. He certainly changes as we begin to unpick his reasons for responsibility for the death. The audience witness Arthur begin to unravel as all his boasts and ambitions appear to evaporate as it becomes clear he may be involved in the suicide or scandal. He becomes rude and protective of his own self-interests. For a grade 9, we might look at Arthur Birling as being concerned about his knighthood and how this is threatened, but the very fact that he would get one is ironic. A knighthood is given by the people to those who serve the community best. This is something that Burling has no interest in actually doing. Let's join Mr Birling then, as he talks us through what happened at the works.
She was an employee at my works, and then I discharged her.
Was that why she committed suicide? When was this, Father?
Oh, just keep quiet, Eric. Oh, well, she left nearly 2 years ago. That was the early autumn of 1910.
Yes, late September 1910.
Oh, that's it.
Look here, so wouldn't you rather I was out?
Oh, no, I don't mind you being here at all, Gerald. There's nothing mysterious or scandalous about this business as far as I'm concerned. No, it's quite a straightforward case, and I don't think the fact that she was discharged from my works has anything to do with the wretched girl's suicide, Inspector?
No, sir, I can't agree with you there.
Why not?
Well, because what happened to her then may have determined what happened to her afterwards. Chain of events.
I can't accept any responsibility for that. Now, if we were responsible for everything that happened to everybody that we ever met, it would be a bit awkward, wouldn't it?
Very awkward.
Put us in a very difficult position, wouldn't it? Yeah, but about this girl, Eva Smith, I remember her quite well now. She's a lively, good-looking girl, country bred, I fancy, and she was employed in one of my machine shops. Anyway, that August, when they got back from their holidays, they were all a bit unsettled, and they decided to ask for more money. Now, I was paying them 22 and sixpence a week, which is neither more nor less than what is generally paid in our industry. Anyway, they wanted a rise in the rate so that they would average about 25 shillings a week. Well, I refused, of course.
Why?
Did you say why?
Yes. Why did you refuse?
Well, I don't see that it's any concern of yours how I choose to run my business, Inspector, is it now?
It's my duty to ask questions.
Well, it's my duty to keep labour costs down. And if I'd agreed to this demand for a new rate, it would have put 12% on labour costs. Does that satisfy you?
So I refused, of course.
I said I couldn't consider it. They could work at the usual rate, but if they didn't want to, then they could go and work somewhere else. Well, it's a free country, isn't it?
It isn't. If you can't go and work somewhere else. Quite so.
Keep out of this, Eric. You hadn't even started at the works when this happened. Anyway, they went on strike. That didn't last long, of course.
It was after the holidays. They'd be all broke if I know them.
Right, Gerald, broke. That's what they were. And so was the strike after a couple of weeks or so. Oh, pitiful affair. Well, I let them all come back at the usual rate, except for 4 or 5 of the ringleaders who started all the trouble. I went down and told them myself, told them to clear out. And Eva Smith was one of them. She'd had a lot to say, far too much, so she had to go.
They couldn't have done anything else.
No.
He could have kept her on.
Rubbish! If you don't come down sharply on some of these people, they'll ask for the earth.
I should say so.
Yeah, well, they might. But it's better to ask for the earth than to take it.
What did you say your name was, Inspector?
Some key quotes then Mr Birling chooses to use to describe Eva Smith. She's a very good worker. He was even ready to promote her. They were averaging 22 and 6, which was neither more or less than paid. So he regards himself as being a typical capitalist, typical businessman. It's my duty to keep labour costs down. He sees it as his duty to be a capitalist, almost like it's a religion. She had a lot to say, far too much, as she had to go. If you don't come down sharply on these people, if they didn't like the rates, they could go work somewhere else. And we let them all come back. Of course, not the 4 or 5 ringleaders who started the trouble. Now let's analyse some of the ways he puts those quotes across. Oh well, put it like that. You can see he pauses, and the sentences here make him sound careless and unaffected. Again, Priestley makes Burling the villain. He nods to the morals behind the inspector's words, but refuses to admit when he's wrong. The tone and repetition here is sneering and sarcastic. The ironic awkward is a simplistic nod to the guilt that his son and daughter will feel later in the play. The use of the question feels rhetorical, as if he wants the inspector to agree with him. Priestley uses the ironic foreshadowing here, as this is a position that the Burlings are in by the end of the play. The writer's purpose. Priestley was disillusioned with capitalism and believed it was the cause of suffering and devastation that Britain faced. 1940 was the lowest point in our nation's history, and we were near defeat. In 1945, the Labour Party, a socialist political group, beat the capitalist Conservatives in a landslide election. Priestley even uses the same words that Labour used in their manifesto that year. They referred to being against hard-headed men of business. It was time for the country to make a change. Socialism meant equality and the society looking after each other. Priestley passionately believed in the same principles. Eva Smith represents the everyday man suffering at the hands of capitalists like Mr Birling, who put money before human life. In summary, Arthur is responsible for the suicide because he sacked Eva Smith. She wanted a higher wage that he couldn't agree to, even though he could afford it. She led other workers and was a leader. And it's implied that she was a better communicator than Arthur. She had rather too much to say. Perhaps he fired her because he realised she was quite similar to himself and didn't like what he saw. Act 2 summary. Arthur is initially off stage trying to persuade Eric to go to bed, most likely to avoid embarrassing his father or stay out of trouble. As the inspector begins questioning Gerald, Arthur tries to cover up certain facts, such as the bar being known for prostitutes, from his own daughter. After the inspector finishes questioning Gerald, Arthur tries to defend the affair, clearly concerned that his business arrangement is now in tatters. After checking on Eric, who's gone out, he then listens to the inspector question his wife. His first reaction on hearing Sybil's involvement is to worry about the public scandal affecting his chances of a knighthood. This is a similar theme that runs throughout the play. Self-preservation seems to be Mr Birling's primary objective. Key quotes then from Act 2 and a summary of Act 3. Arthur listens to the inspector question Eric. He seems more affected by Eric stealing money than anything he learns of how he treated Eva. Once the inspector has left, he immediately turns on his own son and blames him entirely. It is clear that his main worry remains the scandal that looks likely to happen. Arthur becomes excited by the idea the inspector was not a real policeman, and visibly happier once he thinks he's confirmed this to be the case. Realising that they could have all been looking at different photographs, and having called the infirmary and found no girl had been admitted that night for suicide, Arthur shakes the whole thing off pretty easily. He was only worried about scandal, not Eva, and even expects the engagement to be back on once he realises all the events of the play weren't necessarily true. Let's once more look at some of the stage direction and wording that Burling uses. This is right at the end of the play, just before the inspector comes in once more. We're told that Burling is pointing directly to Eric and Sheila. Burling's stage direction here obviously simplistically points at the younger socialists who were to blame. We can see here when he says, "Now look at the pair of them." This prompts the audience to side against him. We are commanded to think about the moralistic lesson that will be taught. We're looking at the younger generation, thinking they're in the right. Mr Birling is, of course, thinking the opposite. He uses a lot of dashes here as his sentences break apart or are interrupted. The dashes here indicate Burling's pause as he reflects on the humour rather than the lesson taught. Once again, the inspector interrupts him. That was the police. A girl has just died on her way to the infirmary. The dashes here suggest the disbelief Burling feels its own morals and rules begin to disappear. We then have stage direction at the end as they stare guiltily and dumbfounded. Sheila faces the door as she rises and the curtain falls slowly. Priestley uses the play's circular narrative of the inspector arriving to highlight that the Burlings and the world learnt nothing from the First World War, so a Second World War became inevitable. The final stage direction exaggerates the lesson that needs to be learnt and the rise of the socialists thanks to Labour's recent election. And lastly, some key quotes from Act 3. So, now we've unpicked each act and Mr Birling's actions in each one, what would the audience in 1945 be thinking about Mr Birling? Well, Burling is driven by duty to capitalism almost like a religion. Many of the audience would share his views on wages and the working class. At the time, the audience wouldn't dislike him, but they may be encouraged to reflect on their own lives and decisions they have made. This may be why he's the first to confess, to give the audience the chance to reflect on their own lives throughout the rest of the play. Now we're going to look at some of the key notes throughout the play of the character. You can see the opening to the paragraph at the top, and you're going to see quotes appear underneath. Quote number 1 and its explanation. Quote number 2 and its explanation. Quote number 3 and its explanation. Moving then to the middle of the play. And then looking more closely at the end of the play. As you can see, the quotes have been explained and analysed in each case. So these last screens, if you were to put them together, gives you a safe pass grade. Now this section of the clip begins to look at exam essay guidance. Remember, this is a morality play. It is trying to teach us the message of socialism. None of the characters are real. They are constructs built to represent different parts of society. Mr Birling is not a real man, and we must remember this as we analyse him in an essay. In the exam, they'll give you 1 page of the play to work with. The focus of this part of the video will be to show you how to get the most from this. On the left-hand side is an example of a page they might give you in the test. When looking at this page, we must bear in mind certain things as we read it. The word choices that Burling chooses to use, the sentence types he uses, the tone of voice he would say as he says these lines on stage, how the characters react to each other, where in the play it comes from, and whether the character speaking is acting in a way you would expect. Mr Birling is normally quite arrogant, he is normally quite full of himself. Is this example we're given proof of that? Now you're going to hear this particular section spoken out loud.
Little. Yes, he didn't keep you on the run as he did the rest of us. I'll admit now, he gave me a bit of a scare at the time. Oh, yeah, but I'd had a very special reason for not wanting any public scandal just now. Here you go, Gerald.
Thank you, sir.
Well, here's to us.
Father, you're forgetting one thing I still can't forget. Everything we said had happened, really had happened. If it didn't end tragically, then that's lucky for us. But it might have done.
But the whole thing's different now. You can see that, can't you? You all helped to kill her. Oh, I wish you could have seen the look on your faces when he said that. Oh, come on, Sheila. You'll have a good laugh over it yet.
Now, as we look at the marking criteria, we need to work out how we're going to get the grade. For Assessment Objective 1, we just need to show understanding of the play and engage in the ideas that are in this extract. For Assessment Objective 2, we need to analyse the language, the structure and the form, making reference to the effects created. How does it make the audience and ourselves feel? Now, as I read the extract, I need to be thinking that this scene comes from the end of the play. Burling is shaken, but still resolutely a capitalist. He has changed from the start as he is now more forceful and more angry. Suggesting to the examiner how he's changed from the rest of the play is really important. We need to show the examiner that the character has changed and developed through the narrative or through the story, even if they've become more of the same thing they were at the start, perhaps in Burling's case. This then is my written answer. By the end of the play, Priestley has Burling return to what he was at the beginning. Priestley sees him as a resolute capitalist. The line, "I'll admit it now, he did give me a bit of a scare at the time," is important as he suggests that he knows that he is a little in the wrong. The phrase, "a bit of a scare," implies that Burling does not see it as serious or something that should affect him. He uses short, sharp statements, as he did at the beginning of the play, to imply to us he is wanting to sound back in control and knows more than the audience. His tone is condescending, as he almost mocks those that have learned a lesson from the inspector's visit. The audience hate Burling and blame him more for the death as he sees and see in his distance from the younger generations as he refuses to admit it when he's wrong. As you can see, I've got my links across the whole play in bold and underlined. The quotes I've used in red, and you can see where I've analysed the quote. I've taken a part of that longer quote and then explained a bit more about it, why the language is being used. My technical language is in blue. I've mentioned the sentence types there, short, sharp statements. And I've also looked at tone of voice. The links to the audience are in green. To us, the audience, and the audience. In this case, it would be wrong to say the reader. This is a play, it's supposed to be seen. This then would be an example of a good grade 5. Now let's look at a whole essay. I'm not going to read it out, so please pause the video as I reveal each paragraph and think about how the marking criteria is being deployed. Where have I analysed? Where have I mentioned the audience? Am I saying a lot about responsibility and Mr Birling, the key themes of the question? How am I wording my answer? How long is my answer? How much have I said about the quotes? This then is my opening paragraph. And paragraph 2. Paragraph 3 from the middle of the play. And my paragraph 4 from the end of the play. You'll notice quite a few of the quotes I'm using are quite short. I want to show the examiner that I'm really looking at the detail of the language. I'm looking at individual word choices and explaining exactly why that word was chosen, based on, of course, my knowledge of Mr Birling and the play as a whole. Thank you very much then for listening to this recording and revision guide for Arthur Birling, which is part of your GCSE post-1914 drama text.